Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to the 14th AFD International Research Conference on Development. Thank you for joining us from all the different parts of the world. I'm Asha Sampet, a journalist on CNBC, and I will be the Masters of Ceremony during the next 2 days of all the open discussions that we will have. We are more than 1,700 connected people gathered here today and from almost 94 countries to explore the role of public development banks in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We are excited to conduct these debates in the framework of the first Finance in Common Summit, a summit which will gather for the first time ever all public development banks, along with public leaders, private sector representatives and civil society advocates in a common endeavour towards a positive future for our planet. We are here today to highlight the crucial role that public development banks could play for building a more efficient, development-oriented financial architecture. In addition, in the light of the current crisis linked to the COVID-19, which prevents us from being here, physically gathered today, we'll look at the contribution in paving the way to a sustainable recovery. Why it's important? Well, because it has never been so urgent to recognize and to boost the role of the public development banks as fantastic agents of change. Our discussions will be based on the findings of the 16 research reports produced by the International Research Initiative on Public Development Banks, which is composed of 28 international researchers from the most prestigious institutions and research centers. They have presented their work last week during the academic days. So today and tomorrow we will build up on their conclusions. The objective, of course, is to draw concrete recommendations for policymakers who will gather at the Finance in Common Summit on November 12th. You can, of course, download these 16 research papers from the Visible Hand platform and watch the replay videos of today and tomorrow's sessions on the platform, as well as on the AFD YouTube channel. Well, we count on you to take part in these discussions through the Send a Message box, where you will be able, of course, to address your questions to the speakers. Of course, a couple of them will be picked, and we'll try to, take as much as we can, depending on the time, of course. And you will, of course, have the opportunity to get in touch with all the registered participants through the live chat tool on the platform. So finally, please don't hesitate to share your insights and to spread the word about the event on social media using the hashtag VisibleHand4Dev. I would also like to thank academic partners without whom this conference would not be possible. The Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, and the Foundation for Studies and Research on International Development. And now, after having said that, and to kick off this conference, I would like to turn and welcome Rémy Rioux, the Chief Executive Officer here at the AFD. Thank you, Rémy, for having us here.
Yes, welcome, Asha. Welcome to everybody.
Right, Rémy, my first question is quite simple. We all know about the invisible hand, so can you tell us a few words? Why the visible hand?
Yes, the invisible hand is the metaphor that was used by Adam Smith, the Economist, to explain that the market's supposed ability to adjust instantly, immediately. And we know this is not true. We know it, we see it in the COVID-19 crisis.
Absolutely.
We see it now that we have to implement the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. And actually, it's never been true. This is what we see in each and every country. So what the conference will establish strongly is that the governments, the societies, they need visible hands. They need visible hands to reconcile short-term and long-term, to spur the transition. And the public development banks, well, they are visible hands at grassroots level, local, national, regional, international, multilateral. They are there and they want to do more.
Right, so probably everybody who's watching us today would like to know what are the ambitions of this conference in light of the challenges that you've underlined?
Science is the word, truth. And so we need evidence-based recommendations to policymakers in order to push the ambition, to clarify the mandate, to align what public development banks are doing with, again, SDGs and climate. And I really want to warmly thank Professor Stephanie Griffiths-Jones from Columbia University, Professor Jiajun Xu from Peking University, my colleague here at AFD, Régis Maraudon. They organized the fantastic work on the academic side for more than a year now, and that's splendid, and it will be an integral and crucial part of the Finance in Common Summit 2 days from now. So we will take all the work, the research papers, your contributions today and tomorrow to feed in the discussion with the leaders and with colleagues of CEOs of public development banks. And of course, today, tomorrow, please do challenge the public development banks, do challenge their shareholders, their supervisors, their stakeholders. We're not there yet, but again, we want to do more, we want to do better, inspired by research.
Absolutely, and we'll of course hear a little bit from the people that you've just mentioned. They will be joining us in the show later. So having said that, yeah, what are the main outcomes that are expected?
For me, the main outcome is really to install this notion, this I would say encompassing concept of public development banks. This is absolutely crucial to know who we are as a community in order then to structure and to move further. And of course, I invite all of you to explore the database, the first ever comprehensive database of all the public development banks we will launch today. To see the magnitude actually of what the firepower of what we are talking about. We even mobilized artificial intelligence to try to begin to measure how we align with SDGs in each and every institution. So that's my main take. And then of course we will listen to all the discussions, all the recommendations from project takers to project makers, how to mobilize the private sector, what is the best possible governance for public development banks, and could we imagine, I would say, a methodology, a taxonomy for SDGs that goes beyond public development banks, because in the end it's not the PDBs in themselves that is interesting, but it's their capacity to reorient the whole financial system in the good direction.
So looking forward to hear all about that. Thank you, Rémy. Thank you very much for your insightful comments, and I will catch up with you on Wednesday.
I think so. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. So we very much look forward to hearing from the researchers and speakers that have been gathered here today. But first, before we do that, we'll watch a video of Joseph Stiglitz, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, who is addressing us from his house in New York City. He specifically underlines the critical bridge that development banks provide for correcting the market failure. Take a look.
It's a real pleasure for me to be able to address this 14th AFD International Research Conference on Development, the Visible Hand, Development Banks in Transition. I've long been a strong believer in the role that development banks can play in promoting growth and development. Never have they been more important as we face the green transition and as the limits of commercial banks have become clearer. Finance is about the allocation of scarce capital. That, in turn, requires information. Markets are not good at gathering, processing, disseminating information. It's a major market failure that was the basis of the research that led eventually to my Nobel Prize. But at a practical level, I saw the consequences of these imperfections in information and financial markets in the arena of development. I was involved in the late 80s, early 90s in a major project called the East Asia Miracle. We wanted to understand what was the source of this tremendous increase in standards of living, income per capita, growth in the countries of East Asia. Not just one country, but country after country. And as we studied what was the source of their success, we saw the critical role of government in development. So important, in fact, that it was referred to as the developing state. But within the developing state, there was a particularly important role for finance and for developmental financial institutions, development banks. So that was where I first became deeply acquainted with the important role that development banks can play in economic development. And then, of course, I saw it much more vividly in the time I served as chief economist at the World Bank at the end of the 90s. The World Bank was a development bank, although sometimes it didn't fully admit it, and it criticized the idea of a development bank at that point. It's changed its mind since then. I thought the World Bank made a difference, not just in the provision of funds, but the production of another global public good, knowledge. And this was especially important in areas where there were global public goods. Both the finance was important, but the knowledge was important. And those are areas like global environment, of which climate change is the central focus of attention today, and global health, concerns about the pandemic through which we are living today. As the world went through the era of neoliberalism, it was an era in which the role of government and development banks was denigrated. But even as that was going on, the limitations of private financial markets became clearer and clearer, especially in the run-up to the 2008 crisis and its aftermath. What we saw then, and we continue to see, is that development requires long-term investments. There is a need for long-term finance. And we also saw that many of the sources of funding were long-term. Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds. But standing between these long-term savers and long-term investment needs were short-term financial markets, short-term financial institutions that were short-sighted. There were problems of corporate governance that led to this kind of short-termism. But those problems of corporate governance have been very hard to correct. Development banks provide a critical bridge, a bridge that can help correct the market failure and serve as a catalyst to the market to enable the market to do better, to play a more important role in development than it otherwise could have played. In short, the roles of development banks and the role of the commercial financial sector can, when done properly, be very complementary. Nick Stern and I had the pleasure to work with the BRICS in their efforts to create a new development bank. And this new development bank has been a real success in providing additional funds, especially for green lending. In that way, it fulfilled one of the hopes of those in Africa, like Prime Minister Meles, who spoke forcefully of the needs of that region for additional funds. As discussions about the creation of a new development bank proceeded, it became clear that a new vision was needed for the development banks of the future. New mandates, focusing on these global public goods like climate change, with new governance, not just dominated by the advanced countries, but by the emerging markets and developing countries with more shared governance, reflecting better the voice of those in the developing world. And new instruments reflecting the advances in finance that have occurred. The new instruments enable development banks to do a better job in allocating and dispersing risk. One of the important aspects of these new development institutions is to recognize not only the limitations of the commercial banks, the private sector, the private financial arrangements, but of the host of institutions surrounding them. The limitations imposed, for instance, by the rating agencies. The rating agencies typically reflect the private sector's short-termism, its short-sightedness. And it's critical that development banks not become subservient to these rating agencies. Development banks have to understand their distinct role, arising to a large extent from the failures of the private sector. And in understanding those limitations, understanding the critical catalytic role that they can play an important role in ensuring more long-term thinking, more long-term development, more long-term finance, more oriented to public goods, to externalities, to the spillovers that occur from one sector to another, from one project to others, and particularly important in the development process. These development spillovers are one of the reasons that development is often stymied. And most importantly, more focused on the public interest than just private profits. Modern development banks, of course, have also learned from some of the failures, institutional failures of the past. We often talk not only about private market failures, but also public failures. But we know we can create institutions that address these government failures or these institutional failures. And one of the challenges of the new development banks is to learn from those past failures. This, in short, is a new era for development banks. Even in the US, long thought as a bastion of private banking, we've realized that private banks have not always served the country well. They were at the center of much of the country's ills. They failed us in 2008, creating the global financial crisis. And they failed in responding to that crisis. What we know is that other institutional arrangements often did much better. We are now in the midst of a new wave of public banks, of development banks, which are needed to respond to today's needs. And most importantly, including green development banks. Even here in New York, the newly created Green Development Bank is playing an important role in providing finance for the green transition. I welcome this opportunity to be here as part of this new movement, which I believe has the potential to transform the economic landscape. Thank you, and I wish you well.
New era for development banks. What a positive note to start this conference with. So thank you very much, Joseph Stiglitz. Now I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Jia Chu, who is joining us live from Beijing, and Régis Maraudon, who is here with us today and have just joined us here on the set. Hello, Régis.
Hello, Asha.
Jia, hello. Can you hear us?
Hello.
It's great to have you here.
Hello.
So let me just properly introduce you guys. So Rioux is the Executive Deputy Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University, and Rémy is a Senior Advisor on Sustainable Finance at the AFD. So it's great to have both of you here with us. So even if you are virtually with us, Rioux, we're happy to have you here. Both of you will guide us through the research that you have conducted together to build a global database of 450 public development banks. So probably just a first question that I will ask straight away to you, Rioux. What is the purpose of such a database?
Well, thank you very much, Asha. I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to introduce you the first comprehensive database on public development banks and development finance institutions worldwide. I will answer your question about the motivations behind building this database. So in the wake of the recent global financial crisis, and especially the outbreak of COVID-19, the role of public development banks has gaining a more and more importance. Public development banks, they are potential policy instrument for promoting equitable and sustainable structural transformation, combating climate change, and play a counter-cyclical role in times of crisis. But so far, very little academic research has been done to systematically examine their role, effectiveness, and development impact. And a major reason behind this positive research is lack of data. And to fill this gap, the Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University and the French Government Agency are joining hands to build an open source database in order to encourage more and more researchers to undertake very rigorous academic research to unleash the potential of public development banks. As Professor Stiglitz just mentioned, we have a new waves of public development banks. We want they can lead the accumulation of market to help us to achieve the green structural transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rioux. So 450 public development banks. This is a great, exciting work, Régis.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it was quite some work, and we are very happy to have developed this partnership with the Beijing University and with INSEE. Hello, Rioux. I mean, very happy to see you online today. And definitely, I mean, not only we have collected the data with the whole team, but we are also putting them online for the first time today for the research community to benefit from it.
So it's a huge step forward.
Yes, indeed it is.
So probably, Régis, you want to go through a little bit the work that you've carried out together with Rioux?
Okay, so I'm very happy to take you into a journey through the first ever comprehensive database on public development banks. Mm-hmm. I will cut it PDBs to make it a bit shorter.
Make it short,
yeah,
of course.
exactly. So let's start with the home page that we have here and the global features. The map shows a synthesis of the information available in the base. Each circle gives the size of the indicator that you can choose in the menu below the map. The selection on screen, for instance, is the number of banks in each country. On the upper side of the map, you can select the banks according to the origin of capitals per continent. And on the menu, just on the right, you may select different kind of options: mandate, association or group of banks, or level of income. Let's take, for example, the G20 members. You may see that the map is changing accordingly and that each circle now gives a summary of the information for this particular group. So let's move now back on the top menu. We have three possible entries to select the information. We can choose, as you can see, financial vision, SDG vision, SDG being Sustainable Development Goals, or particular bank vision. Financial vision permits an overview of the aggregated financial figure when a particular criteria is selected. You may note that in each page you can play with the various criteria and make your own selection. Take, for instance, continent as an entry point and Europe. You can see that assets, equities, number of banks are changing. You can make your own selection, crossing mandates, level of incomes with any other criteria. Let's now move to the SDG vision. Our great team, and really I want to quote in particular Weber, Xinjun in China, Adeline, Bruce, and Barbara here in Paris, have collected, yes, more than 2,000 activity reports, 2,000, with an historical perspective. And this has allowed us to develop a SDG prospecta on 174 banks. The purpose is to assess the alignment of PDB's strategy with the SDGs as they appear in the annual report. So how do we do that? We have developed a machine learning system based on the one created by the SDG Financing Lab of the OECD. We have taught the program to understand the SDG vocabulary. I'm not talking just about words here, but the semantic universe related to each SDG. So the machine reads the report extensively, probably as we would do it, even better.
Better, obviously.
And we get a probability. If you prefer, we get the level of certitude that the annual report mentions a specific SDG. A precise description of the methodology is available online on the website. So shall we see how it looks like? Take the International Development Finance Club, for instance. The colored bars, you see, are changing, and they show the result of that particular group according to the 17 SDG, each of them with one color, with the black bar giving the average of all other banks. IDFC, in our example, is clearly above them all. I suppose we can congratulate the club members, no? But what about the individual data for each bank? So for that, let's move to the Bank Vision tab back on top. Here, we can select a particular institution in the database. As an example, let's take the Trade and Development Bank, TDB, an East African multilateral bank. It is now possible, just a second, the screen will refresh, it is now possible to see the main figures of this particular bank. It will be coming, such as, you know, its date of creation here, or the main financial information just below. Then below, histograms are comparing this particular bank with all other banks performing the same mandate or the one belonging to the same continent. Down below are the SDG histograms based on the same principles as explained before. They permit to see the level of certitude that TDB has incorporated each SDG in the narrative of its annual report. We've pushed further the SDG analysis by drawing for each bank its SDG star that you see now on screen. The principle is quite simple. The graph shows only the SDGs where the score for a selected bank is higher than average. So below average, no ray.
Okay.
The size of the rays shows how far the bank is ahead of average on its way to 100%. So here, quite impressive results on the screen already from this bank. So now, the database is online. You're welcome to connect and play with it. You will see there is much more available. We have also historical data for the banks. We have also international ratings. And please also refer to the paper that we have published with the University of Beijing, with INSEE, called Identifying and Classifying Public Development Bank. It is available on the INSEE, on AFD, and on the conference platform, naturally.
So this is a brilliant tool. And how much work you've put in? How long have you been doing this?
Well, I mean, for instance, on the SDG prospecta, to collect all the information and teach the machine to learn the report, it takes 3 years about that. I mean, the machine has read thousands of reports
before getting there.
Before getting there and before being capable of getting all the semantic of the reports. And now to collect the report and put the database that you have in front of you, it's about a year that we've been working on that, based again on the tremendous work done by the Institute of Structural Economics for the past years too.
So it's, let me just probably seize the opportunity, Régis, just to remind our audience here today that, you know, you can send us your questions, you know, via the platform. So we'll be very happy to take a few and share with us. So we haven't received any questions yet, but we are really looking forward to receive some more questions during the show. And hopefully, Régis, I was looking at all the details on the platform, which is, it's amazing to have all those information together. The objective behind is really to create some kind of collaborative platform where they can, it's also a benchmark where they can see where they stand and where the areas they should be improving.
Well, exactly. Well, if I may, I would suggest probably 3 proposals. If you are a researcher, I mean, the base is yours. It's a unique opportunity for you to dig in it and really try to see what are the correlations between data, and even more, what are, you know, the potential knowledge that you can bring, additional knowledge to our community of development bank. I mean, the data is open source. It can be, any figures can be downloaded from the menu. So I think for the researchers communities, I'm really calling on more researchers to pay attention to us. Now, I would say if you are a development bank, check your data. We've made some errors, obviously.
Probably,
I mean,
just
so
make
many
sure
data.
everything is correct.
So we're really relying on you, you know, to visit the base and send, please, our comments, your comments, etc. Also, put your 2019 reports online or send them to us directly. There is also a link in the About tab on the top. We will be delighted to collect them, and we have started already to collect them online, and we will update the base with this data. And finally, if you are, and probably more important, if you are a development bank and you are not in the base, well, we miss you. I mean, really, please notify your existence, provide us with the data,
yes.
and do not hesitate, you know, to liaise with them, and we will be very happy to add your data, add your name, and put you into our building community.
Right, so Régis, just stay with me. I would like just to probably thank Jiaju, who has been live from Beijing. Thank you, Jiaju. Thank you very much, and hopefully we catch up in the very near future. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
So, Régis, again, so this is a fantastic tool, and now the way forward is really to go and connect with all the different banks, as you just already mentioned. Just a short note to conclude this database session.
Yes, well, we have already 16 research papers online. Each of them is benefiting also from a short video. Every researcher has made the effort of providing a takeaway, you know,
wow.
for decision makers. We have a video, and we have a one-page also policy recommendations. I think all these researchers, one way or another, are also contributing through their work to provide us information, help us to know more about this community which is in the process of being built. There is a purpose. Really, the purpose is we think that they can change the rules of the game. They can enter into the financial world by putting more emphasis on SDGs, by being capable also of teaming up with private sector. I mean, there is a lot of banks in the system that also want to participate in this endeavor. So I hope that our modest database will be a contribution to better knowledge, and at the end of the day, better impact. Yeah.
First step, I would say a great step forward.
Precisely, yes. Yes.
Well, Régis, thank you very much. And again, Jiajun, thank you for this comprehensive presentation of this unique database. So you've heard Régis. Feel free to connect and feel free to share your insight, your data. And if you're not there, I think Régis mentioned it, they would be very happy to take all the input and work with you. So this leads me to turn to the executive director of IDRI, who is the IDRI, as you know, is a think tank which strives to facilitate the transition towards sustainable development. So we have Sebastian Treyer. Sebastian, are you online? Are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Hi, Sebastian. It's great to have you. Just for our audience to know, so you were supposed to be here on the set, but unfortunately, due to the pandemic and all the restrictions, so Sebastian is online with us. So Sebastian will moderate our first panel on SDGs, compatible investments, the trade-off between short-term stimulus and long-term impact. So Sebastian, I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Asha, and I'm really very honored and happy to be not on stage with you, I regret that, but to be with you for this very important conference. I think what we have heard is really that we need to think about how to reconstruct the economies of countries in this long-lasting crisis, and at the same time, put them on track to reach all the long-term objectives of Agenda 2030 with their very high ambition in terms of social and environmental goals. We have been working last week with numerous researchers analyzing the public development banks, what they do, what is their role, their potential role, their impacts, what are their practices, their innovations. And it's really important that today we share these understandings in a dialogue with practitioners and key institutions. So in this first panel, we have a series of questions that I will name rapidly before getting to the panel. First, everybody is agreeing that we need to build back better, but can we be a little bit more precise and say why we all agree that Agenda 2030, in all its components, in its integral program as a transformation agenda, remains the compass for reconstruction and the structural economic transformation of countries, while we are in a crisis that necessitates actually that people look at jobs, short-term salvation for the economy. So is that obvious that Agenda 2030 remains the compass, and particularly because I believe we all share that, what are the challenges? Second question, what is the role of public development banks? What is their comparative advantage or their potential? And third question, what change is needed from them if they want to change the whole economy? Last week we heard of emerging innovations at various levels for these public development banks. But my main question about this panel is maybe we need to talk about something that is closer to revolutionizing these institutions from within and in the relation with the rest of the ecosystem of the economy, if they want to align with Agenda 2030 in order to transform the economy towards reaching Agenda 2030. So that's the type of questions that we will discuss in this session. We have a very eminent panel, and I will present the panelists in a row before getting to the specific questions that we have prepared for them. So first, we are happy to and honored to have Professor Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana is Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value, Director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, UCL. Thank you to be here, Mariana. The second panelist will be also another professor, Professor Kevin Gallagher, Director of the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. Kevin, thank you to be with us. The third panelist is a colleague from WRI. You also in the program that Leonardo Martinez-Diaz was supposed to be, who is the Global Director of the Sustainable Finance Center at WRI, World Resources Institute, but Leonardo will not be able to join. I know that you probably all know that there are lots of things to do in the US now because of the transition period. So, but we are extremely pleased that instead of Leonardo, we have actually Manish Bapna. Manish is the Executive Vice President and Managing Director of WRI. So Manish, thanks for having accepted to step up for your colleague. We are very honored and happy to have you. We also will have in the panel a practitioner, because for the moment I've named professors, the think tank, but we also have the practitioner in the room, to say so. Dr. Friederike Köhler-Geib is the chief economist at KfW, the Kasse für Wiederaufbau, the German reconstruction bank, the public development bank of Germany. Friederike is also the first vice president for the economics department of KfW. Thank you, Friederike, to be with us. And last panelist, Haye Schutte. Mr. Schutte is the head of the Financing for Sustainable Development Division at the OECD. OECD is, of course, also a think tank, if you consider the role that the OECD has had, but of course, you're also much more than that, because your political legitimacy reaches beyond that. And this is why I was mentioning that we will have a mix of experts, practitioners, and key institutions in this framework. So without further ado, I turn to Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana, at UCL, but also in your academic work in general, you are one of the key experts globally on what we would call the visible hand. I mean, you're one of the academics that has rehabilitated the role of the state, the role of public intervention in general, in the field of innovation policies, but also you've been publishing on public development banks. And I would ask you two questions. Do you believe that Agenda 2030 is still the compass, even in times of crisis and emergency, and as I said, where people and countries are looking for jobs first? And why? So could you substantiate why you think it's still important? And why does public intervention matter for such a transformation? And in particular, what is the role of public development banks? Mariana, the floor is yours.
Sure. So, well, thank you. And you mentioned the word crisis. So my first question back to you is, which crisis are we talking about? We're actually living through multiple crises, and that's exactly the problem. We go from crisis to crisis, and in some ways, the way that actually economic theory informs policymaking, and by policymaking, I mean that distributed network of different types of public agencies at the city level, regional, national, international. This idea that, the whole point is just to fix market failures literally means you have to wait for a crisis, whether it's a small one or a large one, so a market failure to occur before you have any role. And I think the really inspiring thing about the SDGs is they're not seen as system failures. They're actually seen as reimagining what kind of future we want to live in. What's extraordinary in economics is that even a great concept like the public good is even seen as fixing a problem, which is that created by positive externalities. So using the SDGs, the 17 global goals that, I've got 4 kids, they all know about these goals. They're actually taught in primary schools and in secondary schools, which is fantastic. Using these goals to really transform our system and to admit that to do so, we need to actually talk about directionality. This isn't just about growth. It's not about building back better. It's about fundamentally transforming the kind of growth we have, right? So these crises that we're living through are health pandemics, climate change, the economic crisis, of course, that we still haven't completely gotten back on our feet from the financial crisis, let alone the economic crisis that's coming from the health pandemic. What that actually requires is having a completely new way to even frame policymaking. And what the goals allow us to do is to actually really tackle the 169 targets beneath the SDGs, but to use them to transform how we think about industrial strategy, how we think about public procurement, how we think about innovation policy. Just think of all the different instruments, the grants, the loans, the procurement, the prize schemes. Instead of just being seen as handouts, or during a crisis like the health pandemic, the need to immediately bail out certain sectors, how do we actually use the opportunity that's provided to us when government does have a role to actually transform those instruments, to crowd in as much as possible different types of actors in the business sector, but also increasingly in the nonprofit sector, to collaborate, to invest, to innovate towards the goals. But that means we need an outcomes orientation, or what I call a mission orientation to the policies themselves, so that industrial strategy is no longer just a list of sectors, for example, that need support, but problems like the future of mobility, a plastic-free ocean, a carbon-neutral city, healthy aging, which then requires every sector. I can't imagine one sector that wouldn't be part of a carbon-neutral, agenda. But that really requires new design of the instruments themselves. And public banks are absolutely central in this discussion because finance isn't neutral. There's no lack of finance out there. There's plenty of finance. What we don't have is enough patient, long-term, committed finance. So even say venture capital is very exit-driven. It wants to exit in 5, maximum kind of 7 years. What you need in the Death Valley stage, for example, of many different areas is, that patient finance even for 15 to 20 years. And that's what development banks have provided in the past. But to make sure that they themselves think about that redesign opportunity. So it's less about handing out money to sectors or firms that are in trouble, but even to, say, bringing in conditionalities. So the loans that are provided are conditional on whether it's carbon reduction or corporate governance issues like not using, tax havens and so on. And I think this is the opportunity we're living through today, which is that building back better, if we're really going to do that, it's a real design challenge because the status quo right now is what got us into the crisis. So we need to redesign the instruments on the ground. And it's not enough to say the state matters. It itself needs to be kind of a thorn in its own side to redesign the instruments to galvanize and catalyze investment and innovation towards the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Mariana. That was a very strong initial statement, and we might need to come back about what it means to redesign those instruments and to what extent we might think of redesigning also the instruments of the PDBs. This is why probably I turn to Kevin Gallagher. Kevin, thank you again. You've been working for years also on studying the public development banks and their role, their capacities, but also you've been in the research program that was discussed during the academic days last week. So you also saw what other research papers dealt with the same issue. So I have a series of questions to you. So why, in your perspective, is the alignment of public development banks with Agenda 2030 important? We heard Mariana, and you might want to add something on that. And also, what is the magnitude of the change that this actually means for them? So what type of redesign or revolution for these institutions does that mean? And if you could also give us some understanding of your assessment of the current state of alignment of public development banks with Agenda 2030 and what they do to improve this alignment. What are they already doing? What could they do to scale it up also to be better aligned with Agenda 2030? What's your take on these questions?
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I really wish I was there with all of you folks. I'll make 3 points. Number one is that sustainable infrastructure investments should be high priority for PDBs right now because it's most poised to accelerate a COVID crisis recovery and is aligned with Agenda 2030. Unfortunately, according to our research, however, though, PDBs are not aligned right now with mobilizing the necessary investments for sustainable infrastructure in particular and Agenda 23 in general. It's urgent, and this summit is a perfect time for it, for PDBs to scale their sustainable infrastructure efforts and collaborate as a system. This shouldn't be the first FIC summit. This should be the beginning of a new system. Now is not the time to put our agenda aside to try to deal with the crisis. As Mariana said, in many ways, the crisis is among us not because we aren't dealing with Agenda 2030. We all know that infrastructure finance is always one of the most important things as part of a recession to try to put countercyclical financing into a recovery because it has what's called the largest multiplier effect. It brings in the private sector, which is always the most reluctant in the middle of a crisis. What we learn is that if you invest in sustainable infrastructure, which we define as infrastructure projects that are planned, designed, constructed, operated, and decommissioned in a manner that ensures an economic, financial, social, environmental, and institutional sustainability during the entire life cycle of the project, that you can meet more sustainable development goals through such investments than almost any other kind of investment across the spectrum. On an environmental perspective, that means decarbonizing by 2050 and massive investments in climate resilience. One of the least talked about chapters in the World Economic Outlook of the IMF is a study where they model what the impact of a sustainable infrastructure-led recovery would be relative to a conventional recovery. And they find that if there's a massive 10-year sustainable infrastructure push, if there's 10 years of subsidizing renewable energy transitions and compensatory transfers for households, along with a gradual tax increase after the recession is over and a shift from carbon neutral to carbon intensive industries, that the recovery will have a 2 percentage point stronger recovery than otherwise. Unfortunately, according to a report that we did last year with the Brookings Institution, the PDBs are not really stepping up in this space. we calculate that in order to meet the SDGs and a 2-degree target, which is not enough with respect to climate change, that the world community needs to mobilize an additional 2.1% of GDP on an annual basis in between now and 2030. Again, it's not the time to put that aside. It's time to put that at the center of the recovery effort. Unfortunately, we find that multilateral development banks are doing very poor in that space. They're only investing about 0.3% towards that global target. National development banks like the KfW, like the China Development Bank, like the New Development Bank are doing better, but still only financing about 1.2% of that need. And private financial flows, only 0.5% of that need. We calculated that based on the IDFC MDB joint methodology for calculating green finance and sustainable infrastructure. We project that that if MDBs shift their balance, not MDBs, PDBs shift their balance sheets, commit to aligning a certain percentage of their balance sheet to sustainable infrastructure, and increase the scale of their balance sheets, they can mobilize a lot more finance. Number one, a lot of the PDBs are not maximizing what's called their lending headroom. They've been very, very conservative because of credit ratings and so forth after the financial crisis, but that's been self-imposed. We calculate that if DFIs or PBDs maximize their lending headroom and have a 25% capital increase and decide to shift their balance sheets to 35% investment towards Agenda 2030, that they'd be able to mobilize an extra $541 billion on an annual basis. If they had a more ambitious target, the 35% comes closer to where multilateral development banks are. But the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Bank, has decided that 66% of its balance sheet will go in that direction. If they shifted to 66% with the 25% capital increase and maximize their lending headroom, they'd be able to mobilize an extra $650 billion a year. So this summit, my last comment here, this summit is vitally important and it should not be the last, it should be the first. But to start off, PDBs that are part of this summit should commit to 4 things. Number one, align their balance sheet with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 2, a stepwise increase in capital to meet these new commitments. Number 3, commit to start acting as a system through future summits, sharing of best practices, collaborating, and so forth. And number 4, to be inclusive, to make sure that they're working with their governments, working with their private sector, working with civil society organizations and affected communities to make sure that this alignment is sustainable, accountable, and in the right direction. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. And I'm really, I mean, the wealth of details that you've been able to transmit to us in 5 minutes was extremely useful. We will probably come back to that in terms of assessment and both assessment and recommendations. I would like to turn to Manish Bhatna. Manish, at WRI, you have been studying for a long time, particularly I would say the multilateral development banks and their alignment with climate. And to some extent now you're in the perspective of looking at how you can learn from climate alignment or Paris alignment towards SDG alignment. So the 2 questions that I'd like to ask you are of course the following. What can we learn from the change and the learning curve of multilateral development banks? And how cautious should we be to transfer those lessons to national development banks or subnational development banks? What can we learn, but also how cautious should we be? And also, how can we learn from the alignment with Paris, or with the climate objectives, and make it a lesson or a first step if we want to align with Agenda 2030 on the whole? Do you have both recommendations on what could be done and also on what we should be cautious about? Manish, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Sebastian. I want to start actually with just a quick reflection on the challenge, just building a little bit from Mariana's point about the scale of transformation we need. We're here 5 years after the Paris Accord on climate was signed. Carbon emissions are at 40 gigatons here at the end of 2020, right? We're going to need to, in order to meet something close to a 1.5 degree pathway, we're going to have to decrease that by half every decade. 20 gigatons by 2030, 10 gigatons by 2040, 5 gigatons by 2050, and those 5 gigatons will have to find negative emission technologies in order to address. And the point here is that we are not talking about incremental change. We're talking about whole-scale transformation, and that will require significant fundamental change in all the core economic systems in the planet today. And that's just on climate. And when one looks at the entire SDG agenda, we should not downplay the systemic change that we need across a wide range of sectors. And it's in that context that I think this conversation and this question is just so incredibly important. In 2018, the multilateral development banks put forward a plan around how they were going to actually comply with Article 2.1c in the Paris Agreement. And that article, which I suspect everyone is quite familiar with, is about how to make financial flows consistent with the Paris objective. They built this out, they kind of unpacked this into 6 building blocks on mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, policy support, reporting, and their own internal operations. And over the past couple of years, they've been trying to develop that framework further and put it in practice. They've made some good progress on mitigation and adaptation, but I think to some extent, there's been some challenges kind of in 2 areas. One is around the coverage, that the application of their approach to embedding the Paris Agreement looks at kind of new lending, doesn't look at their existing portfolio, doesn't actively look at investments through financial intermediaries, and also looks primarily at projects, but doesn't necessarily look at policy support. So one of the interesting observations about the MDB experience with Paris alignment is this issue of how do we ensure adequate coverage. The second has to do with pace. The crisis, the economic and COVID-19 health pandemic has really made things a little bit less fast-paced as we would have expected. Right now, the timeline is looking at 2023, 2024, when they would actually show full alignment. And so there's a question around pace that I think we also need to be careful about, given the challenge at scale. So when you come to what are the lessons from the MDB experience over the past 2-3 years, in terms of what can that kind of share, what are the lessons that we could look for public development banks more broadly at the SDG agenda? 3 lessons come to mind that I think are worth talking about. One is that one really needs to have a whole of bank approach, right? Not looking only at projects, not looking at future lending, but really how do we embed Paris alignment or SDG alignment, not only in their investment lending, but in their policy support, in their technical advice, in their analytical work, in their country strategies. So that whole of bank approach, incredibly important. The second lesson is how one actually puts in place a framework to assess alignment. So for mitigation, for example, the MDBs have developed kind of a framework that looks at what types of investments are aligned, what types might be misaligned, and what types might be conditionally aligned. Aligned investments, renewables, non-motorized kind of transport infrastructure, clearly aligned with the Paris Agreement. Misaligned, coal-fired power plants, upstream oil and gas exploration. But there's a lot that could be conditionally aligned or not aligned. You look at certain types of gas plants under certain conditions. Would they be actually compatible with the Paris Agreement or not? You look at grid infrastructure. Would grid infrastructure be connected or helping support more lower carbon energy sources, power sources, or higher carbon sources? And what are the implications for that? So the second part here is there's some real lessons that the MDBs have put in place around trying to assess alignment of different types of investment projects, and particularly trying to put in place frameworks that can help them better understand those that may or may not be aligned. The third and last lesson, I think, has to do really with the response to the COVID crisis. What we have seen is actually not a lot of alignment in terms of the immediate response to the crisis with the Paris Agreement or the SDGs. And what we hear are 2 different things. We're hearing many of the banks say we're not hearing that demand from countries. We've done a lot of surveys. We've spoken to countries, and they say that they're not seeing the financing for those type of projects that both respond to the immediate needs, but also deal with the long-term kind of crisis. And so I think the third lesson is how we actually put in place support to countries to help them develop and actually create more bankable projects that both respond to the short and medium term. That's an area that I think the multilateral development banks are starting to invest in, and something that the public development banks need to do. So the whole of bank kind of approach, getting framework for how to assess alignment, knowing a lot will be in that gray area. And third is kind of really how to support countries, leverage their NDCs, leverage their sustainable development goal action plans in ways that can actually create bankable projects that respond both to the short and medium term are three lessons I think that we have for the public development banks. Thank you very much, Sebastian.
Thank you very much, Manish, and that was also very efficient. Thank you for the three lessons that we will bear in mind. I think they echo very much what we have heard last week in the academic days about the whole of the bank approach. That is something that some of the national development banks also aim at. And the key question that I think we will come back to in the question and answers part on how do you make a framework to assess alignment when it's not only about mitigation, but it's about the whole of the SDGs. And that's a key challenge I think we will need to come back to. I just want to also remind the audience that you are most welcome to use the question and answer platform to ask questions and also put comments that the Master of Ceremonies, Asha, will be facilitating and asking to the panel once we've finished with the question and answers among the panelists. So please don't hesitate to use the question and answer platform. So now we've heard three analytical, but also lots of recommendations, but three analysts who have been analyzing the animals that are these public development banks. And I'd like to turn to Fritzi Köhler-Geib because you're living within the animal. So how is it, the question that I have for you as a chief economist of KfW is, how do you see your role as a public development bank, and why does it matter that you align with Agenda 2030? How can a public development bank like yours contribute concretely? What does that mean? Could you have some examples about that? And I think we'd be also keen to see how you see for your own organization this challenge in this whole of a bank approach that Manish told about. How are you currently doing on aligning with Agenda 2030, and what are the challenges ahead for you?
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. I very much liked to listen also to Mariana's, Kevin's, and Manish's points. And I'd like to add 3 points here, and that's one. There is the concern that in the COVID crisis, the transformation to doing business in a more sustainable way may drop in priority, and that there is a trade-off. In principle, I think there needs not to be a trade-off, quite to the contrary. And it's referring to a point that also Mariana made, that there is actually need to stabilize the economy. We do see in our data that the private sector is investing less in this time. And so there is the need for the state to step in, to support, to incentivize, and so on. And here I think comes the point that if that is done not only with perspective to stabilization, but much rather with regards to the structural changes that are necessary to be successful in that shift towards a new, more sustainable way of doing business, I think there does not have to be the trade-off. Development banks play a crucial role in this. And I see actually two particular ways in which development banks contribute. And that is one, providing sustainable financing that mobilizes further private capital. And then two, by establishing sustainability standards that can be used in capital markets. And I think that KfW is on this track. It's working on it because there is no, and that's basically the second point. So development banks have an important role to play, and KfW is on the way. Because there is no standardized procedure for reporting on the SDG, KfW has developed its own group-wide SDG mapping. And this mapping offers a standardized procedure for transparently reporting annually on the intended positive contributions of KfW's newly committed financing activities to achieve the SDGs. And when we look at the commitments, climate action measures by themselves represent 28 billion euro. And with that, KfW so far is one of the leading supporters of Paris climate targets. There is also this agenda of Paris compatibility and basically achieving a climate neutral portfolio by 2050. And here, KfW is setting up exclusion lists, is also working on technology paths. And now I'm referring to something that Kevin mentioned. It requires actually a careful discussion and alignment with governments and also with other stakeholders in the economy. Development banks can't do that by themselves. A third element that I would like to mention under the second point, the role of development banks, is a national program that KfW has, the Klimaschutzinitiative Mittelstand, where KfW is providing subsidized loans that basically support the EU taxonomy. And certainly, and that's a point that you also asked about, Sébastien, there are challenges on the way, of course, no? Because one can imagine points where there are attractive business activities and one would decide not to engage because they may not be aligned with the goals. And of course, there need to be trade-offs in that context. And another point is related to information. Basically, there needs to be harmonized information for bank-wide monitoring tools and reporting. And that is the third point. That actually, to successfully align with the SDGs, there is really a high demand for reliable and informative data to that effect. And I'll leave it here, and I'm happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Friederike. That was really extremely useful to hear from one of the practitioners, and not just about those who study, but also understand how you manage to see your role and your progresses. And I think Kevin mentioned it also, but you insisted on that particularly. The idea is that there is a whole connection between what the public development banks can do and their ecosystem, meaning the private players, but also the rest of the society, the government, the public policies. But one key important question is, of course, what role can these banks play with regard to the private sector? And we are very happy to have as a contributor in the panel Haye Schutte, because OECD and UNDP have been working on the G7 mandate on what it means for the private sector to align with Agenda 2030, meaning both the private sector in general, but also specifically the financial private sector. And so my general question would be, from your work, why should all these actors align with SDGs? What does alignment mean for them? How complicated is it also to represent what alignment with 17 goals, what that could mean? And of course, how do you relate what private sector players are doing with regard to alignment with the role of public development banks? So in general, what are your current findings? I know that you're going to present them, or you presented them this morning. I don't know exactly. It's going to be a week full of events, but I know that this is also a very recent results that you can tell us about on the state of alignment of the private sector with Agenda 2030. Haye, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Thanks for the organizers to invite us here to do a bit of a sneak preview, I have to say, on work that is going to be officially launched and presented at the Paris Peace Forum, also with some additional contributions at the Finance and Commons Summit. So that's Thursday this week. Basically, as you're asking for the private sector, I mean, there's a lot of progress, I think, but one has to, I think, acknowledge, as Mariana and others have referred to, that overall, I think we believe that the private sector is lagging behind, basically, in aligning its finance with the SDGs. A recent survey, for example, of some 75 of the greatest asset managers showed that only less than half of those are actually developing an approach to the SDGs. Of the companies that are reporting to the UN principles for responsible investments, only 50% refer to the SDGs. That's good, not sufficient, but only 10% of them are actually describing in some detail what they actually do. Now, we know from the magnitudes of the finance that is necessary to address the pre-COVID financing, SDG financing gap. We'll typically talk about something like 2.5 trillion annually. We talk about probably 1 trillion that is now necessary in 2020 alone, basically to step in order to do a COVID recovery package in developing countries. So I have probably something like a 3.5 trillion financing gap currently that we're talking about. That only a small part will be actually be able to be covered from public, especially concessional public resources. Now, on the other hand, there is the substantial global assets that are currently floating around, especially in the global north, something like 379 trillion. And so what we try to say is basically, if we would be able to align 1% on that, we would basically be able to address this financing gap. So 1% for one planet. Now, when we talk to us about the Sebastian, about alignment, we basically say, well, it should have a positive impact towards the SDGs over the life cycle of the investment, and should ensure that the investments do not harm across the SDGs. And it has an equality dimension, leaving no one behind, but also a sustainability dimension. Now, to your second, if you like, question about the role of the public development banks. Well, we believe that, and that's the ambition, I think, also of the Finance and Commons Summit, that the public development banks do a very important role, and Federica was just referring to that, but they could actually do much better. And basically, they are sitting at this sweet spot between domestic and international money, between public and market, between public and private finance. And yes, they do extremely well, and Marish and Kevin have outlined, obviously some of the gaps there. But we believe that they not only should be a funder, but also, some Federica referred to, be much more a capitalizer, a catalyst, basically, for additional funding, especially from the private sector. So, and here they can also help the governments to build markets to do so, and basically help also governments in their policy reforms to do so. Now, let me, maybe in your last point here, come to the framework that we have been developing with some 80 experts and institutions in the course of last year, together with UNDP under a G7 mandate. And basically, it tries to address the issue of what does SDG alignment mean? So what is the framework? I think Manish was referring to that, to capsulate that. Now, SDG alignment will not happen spontaneous. We believe that there are three issues that are preventing an alignment. I mean, first of all, there's a lack of transparency in sustainable finance. So there's a proliferation of standards and initiatives, and that basically then is also making it difficult for the private sector to basically address the funding in line with the SDGs. Second, there's a lack of accountability. So especially in regard to non-financial returns. So most of the current things that are out there, they're basically voluntary, they lack teeth, And thereby, we believe the risk to be kind of an undermining of efforts towards sustainable investment. Third, there's a lack of coherence. So there is basically driven by a lack of incentives and fragmented regulation. Fossil fuel subsidies to be, for example, one example. OECD and G20 countries are providing something like 180 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. It has been referred to already prior, and we believe there's a need for better alignment of policies. Now, the framework that we're going to launch, and let me conclude with that, Sebastian, is basically calling for objectives and policy actions around 3 pillars. So one, better policies to create appropriate incentives, promote accountability, and basically thereby create more efficient markets. Second, standards that would raise the bar on sustainability, and that would strive for transparency, for accountability and harmonization. And yes, there's a lot out there, but we believe there needs to be a push for a common set of standards, underlined with appropriate methodologies and accounting mechanism. And my last pillar there is to have better tools to leverage existing resources, both from public as well as private sources. Now, this is an agenda that we see needs to be taken forward by public development banks, but also by policy fora like the G7, G20, we as the OECD, but also the UN system, I think is ready to support there, but also certainly by the private financial community. And with that, back to you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much, and thanks for all the 5 panelists who have been so efficient. We still have around a quarter of an hour to ask some questions that I think I would like to ask you before going to the questions of the audience. And my main point is actually, I have actually 2 main points on which I would like those of you who want to react to be able to make a reaction. The first thing is that we are, of course, under a lot of scrutiny in this Financing Commons Summit, where we talk about the potential of public development banks, while NGOs are saying, but those public development banks, for the moment, they are misaligned. They show the numbers about fossil fuel, etc. So we should be, I think, quite clear about this issue that a lot of the assessments that we need to do are about scale, pace, but also directionality. And I think on the directionality part, we can show what is misaligned with climate. Manish told us about that. But I think we are still struggling to explain what it means to be misaligned with SDGs. And that's something that I would like to if some of you want, I mean, not all of you, but some of you want to react on, how do we measure the misalignment in terms of directionality? That's something that is quite important. I think Mariana wants to go for an answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways to look at misalignment. The most obvious way is that unless you have a really explicit mission, for example, like the EIB does now to become the climate bank, right? There's a risk that in the end, you will just disperse a lot of funds with these kind of false categories. I personally believe, and I know this is very controversial, but I'm not a politician, so I can say it, that there's a misplaced emphasis, for example, on SMEs, on small, medium enterprises. What you really want to do is help SMEs scale up, not just remain small. And then to help them scale up, the question is, what is the kind of demand pull or the supply push that you're scaling up towards, right? So that's why, on some other instruments, government procurement has been so important to create the kind of markets that SMEs need. And it's those kinds of policies that have helped SMEs the most, rather than just this blanket notion of let's help cute little companies. But the really interesting alignment, I think, has to be, not just with the obvious stuff, like having, a green kind of / climate set of missions that you then help align towards, but actually realign what we even mean by public-private partnerships. And, different contributors talked about that. What I think has been really interesting in some countries, like in Germany, where the KfW ended up providing loans, patient loans, to the steel sector, not simply because it was in trouble, right? Steel is in trouble everywhere and is coming begging for money everywhere. The loans were provided conditional on the steel industry lowering its material content. To do that, they had to innovate, they had to invest, they had to use new techniques towards repurpose, reuse, and recycle. That wouldn't have happened just by going to Davos and saying, oh, we need to be more purpose-oriented. Oh, we need stakeholder value. It occurred because there was a condition attached. It was mandatory in order to actually access taxpayer funds, right? So instead of thinking of handouts and bailouts, or even this concept of enabling and facilitating, actually really bringing in different design features, coming back to my concept before, designing in conditionalities that shouldn't be seen as a stick, but as a real kind of win-win, right? The state is not here just to hand out money. And that's where things have gone wrong in Italy, where I'm from, right? Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, a public bank in Italy. Historically, it's changing now, I hope. There's lots of talk of change, but in the past, it's been really there to save companies and industries in trouble, which means that the state is always there, just kind of, bailing, out industries as opposed to really creating strong pressure for them to transform. And this notion that was mentioned by Manish before, that this has to be cross-sectoral, and I really believe in the cross-sectoral approach. How old sectors like steel or new sectors like digital and AI can be part of a common mission. It's not going to happen unless you embed it within the structure of the grants, the loans, and the other tools.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I just want to, I understand that Manish wants to come in. It's complicated to be a facilitator when you're not on the same place, so you don't see exactly what people want to do. But I wanted to add something, because to some extent, I jump on something that Kevin and Manish have mentioned. I mean, you understand what it means to be aligned with mitigation, but if you want to have sustainable infrastructure that are also aligned with to say biodiversity, for instance, that's going to be challenging, and mostly depending on local context, I would say. So how can we, at the same time, assess the alignment of the community of development banks with SDGs, while aligning with SDGs might be something that you can measure only at local scale? Is that something that, I don't know, Manish, I don't want to push you in that direction, but maybe you want to react on that.
No, I think that's exactly the right question, Sebastian, because we're dealing with multiple crises, right? So you have, just take, for example, irrigation. A lot of public development banks invest in irrigation programs around the world. At one level, that could be incredibly important for achieving food production, rural poverty, food security goals. On another, if you're in a water scarce area, is that going to extract more water than we have available at a time of 2 or 3 degrees of warming? Will water-intensive crops be actually what we should be growing in that area? So you're going to see road infrastructure for private cars, perhaps okay at some point in time, but perhaps not at other points in time. So as we move from Paris to SDG, we're going to see even more potential trade-offs between investments in certain areas. And so this kind of framework of how one thinks about investments that could be conditionally aligned will require a much more in-depth understanding, as you exactly said, of the local and national context and how one thinks about those trade-offs when one is facing multiple crises. And so to me, that gets into the importance of actually, the SDG and NDCs, the actual analysis that goes into situating and understanding what the priorities should be in a country in our local context, recognizing the interdependence, the synergies and the trade-offs between these different agencies. And that's where support to help countries think through that will be incredibly well placed to enable them to respond to these multiple crises at the same time.
Thank you, Manish. I know that I should give the floor to Frédéric and Haya, but maybe we want to hear some questions from the audience. Asha, maybe so that you can also react on those questions.
Absolutely. That was a brilliant discussion, Sebastian. I think you handled it very nice and nicely, because being online and virtually not seeing people is very challenging. You've done a great job so far. So thank you, everyone, for highlighting the priority objectives to achieve the alignment of the SDGs. We have a couple of questions here, and we have approximately 10 minutes, so it should be we should be able to take a few of them. So Sebastian, probably there's this first question here on long-term versus short-term. That is the question. So how can development banks really, conciliate the enormous challenge behind our day-to-day consumption and behaviors with global imbalances such as climate? So briefly, I don't know who would like to pick that question there.
Maybe I have to turn to those who haven't spoken yet in the second round of questions. So,
absolutely.
From KfW, how do you handle long-term and short-term?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to societal goals, as for example climate neutrality, I think this is exactly the area where you want to provide loans with subsidized interest rates, where you basically want to have an interest differential. Of course, that's a challenge in times when interest rate levels are particularly low, but that then is a question about how to implement it, and we've found ways around it. But I think what you really need is, and I think it came through in the entire discussion, basically financing is part of the story, and I think that for KfW at least, the SDG mapping in itself of the portfolio has been a really important step, because it creates transparency, because you take stock of where you are, and you get aware of the different trade-offs that were alluded to. But then you also do have complementary policies that are necessary. I think, for example, when we think about climate neutrality, we do need reliable and planably increasing CO2 price signal. Otherwise, you won't get the incentives for the private sector and for consumers to alter their decisions. And I think that at the end is a political decision where to set it, or basically to put in place the mechanisms that we come to that path. And then I would just like to say that there is really also that point of the trade-offs between different SDG goals. And on that one, Mariana, I think one has to talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, maybe not in this panel, but actually there are different opinions. No, of course you do want them to scale, and they do play an important role for employment and so on. And also on the tissue of society. And I think we can't underestimate this point, and it's actually also related to SDGs. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Brilliant. Sebastian, another question here on from Caterina Fonseca, who is asking if multilateral development banks are aligning investments with the Paris Agreement, but not aligned to the 2030 SDGs agenda. So they aim at different things. The taxonomies are different, and at some level, they're also contradictions. So how can we go about this? Are there any examples of PDBs aligned to both the agenda, the 2030 agenda, and the Paris Agreement? That was a long question, but I think it was important to give some background first.
Yes, I mean the question was asked initially about MDBs, and I think Manish already answered that it was already challenging for them to align with the Paris Agreement. And Manish, do you have any example of that? And then I probably need to turn also to Hayes so that you know his point about that.
Just a quick example, maybe.
I mean, so I think the MDBs are moving towards Paris alignment, but they're not there yet. Right now, they're looking to try to get there by 2023, 2024. But what we need to make sure is that it isn't that if something is misaligned, that it should not be funded by the MDBs, not just be a factor into their decision making. One of the things that the banks will be, the multilateral development banks will be confronting about Paris alignment, the example, is around gas. Under what conditions are investments in natural gas aligned with Paris, and where are they not? That is going to be a very important example or question. To your second point, though, I would argue that the Paris Agreement and the SDGs are inextricably interlinked and interdependent. So we should be looking at these as one holistic agenda, not as two separate agendas that are competing. And that gets back to this earlier point about how we think about investments that really tackle multiple crises at the same time, or multiple challenges at the same time.
Right. I think Manish, the audience was very interested in everything that you've put out there during your presentations. We got quite a couple of questions on that topic. Obviously, I'm not going through all of them, but globally, what you just covered most of it. So another question here from Tommaso Ferrando. So in the last 2 decades, development banks have increased the percentage of blended finance and partnering with private finance, PFs mainly. So how is it compatible with the idea of public money for public goods and the mission orientation that Mariana was mentioning earlier before?
If you agree, Asha, because it's a strange role that I have, I'm now directing your questions, but I think Haya has precisely been looking about that, and we could
absolutely.
Maybe a last word to Mariana.
Sure, happy to come on this. I mean, obviously, quite a number of public development banks are already engaging in mobilizing private finance. We believe, as I mentioned earlier, not to the extent they could, and probably they should. And we believe that's partly also that they need to basically encapsulate this kind of role of mobilizing more resources as part of the mandate of their objectives, of their KPIs. There's also a bit of capacity building that is actually necessary here in order to allow them to have this kind of catalytic role to play. Just to say that, for example, also on what Manish was referring to, just on Friday last week, the OECD put out its biannual report on the climate finance 100 billion commitment by 2020. You know that as part of the Paris Agreement, MDBs, or everybody basically, we collectively, the global North, committed to provide 100 billion by 2020 of funding. Just to say that we have seen a rather stagnating, at least according to our figures, of the performance of the MDBs. Now, the most recent reliable figures that we had were actually only from 2018, but also the kind of knowledge and the data that we're getting for 2019 shows that while bilateral funding has actually increased, it has been rather, the MDBs have not in the same vein and in target to the 100 billion objective by 2020 increased their deliberations in mobilizing this private finance. So there is, I think, more that they can do, and it's very much, I think, what is necessary is much this kind of transformational redesign, the revolution to a certain extent that colleagues here talked about, that is part of the answer of how to do this.
Maybe I wanted to ask Mariana, how do you do public-private partnerships and at the same time want to target public money for public goods? Is that a contradiction in terms or not?
No, I mean, that's why I mentioned at the beginning, I actually think the concept of the public good works when we're talking about, some siloed areas, say like basic research. But if we're talking about the discussion about SDGs, it's actually in some ways more useful to talk about the common good, which interestingly is something actually that the Vatican through Pope Francis, he talks about that a lot. And he's actually quite radical, more radical than many politicians. And that is exactly what then requires a new social compact. What does it mean to bring purpose into an area that's not just about corporate governance, again, the kind of Davos stuff, but actually purpose at the center of the system? How do you have a purposeful public-private partnership? I live in the UK, and I can tell you that our private financing initiative, which is how the private sector came in to work with the National Health Service around health, was definitely not symbiotic. It was definitely not mutualistic. It was actually using the words that biologists use when they look at ecosystems, predatory. It was, a parasitic ecosystem, not a mutualistic, symbiotic one. So we actually need better metrics. Just like we have ESG metrics, we need metrics on partnerships. This is something my institute's working on. But just coming back to your previous question on examples, we actually helped set up a new public bank from scratch in Scotland, working closely with Nicola Sturgeon. It's called the Mission-Oriented Scottish National Investment Bank. And the idea was precisely to get the bank to be part of a symbiotic ecosystem that was focusing on big public goals that required massive amounts of private innovation and investment, but the way that the bank actually then collaborated with the private sector was just as important. So they, for example, have a business pledge, which until recently has been voluntary for companies to sign up to paying the living wage, reinvesting profits instead of using share buybacks, and so on. How to make that list of 10 kind of rules of what it means to be a good company part of the way that you actually engage with public policy. And that, again, comes back to the issue of conditionality, which maybe we should call it something else, because the word conditionality sounds a bit negative. It's about a pact. What does it mean to actually work together for something that will really be, better for everyone, for citizens? I mean, govern it in a different way.
Sebastian, you have less than a minute to conclude. It was very exciting to listen to all of you. Probably just wrap up the session for us and the key takeaways there.
Thank you very much, Asha, and thanks to all panelists. I'm sorry we've lost Kevin in the meantime because of bad connections, but it would have happened in real life. But this is a lot of very lively discussion, so that's already a lot. Thank you very much to you all. I just want to, my key takeaways are this idea of a whole of the bank approach. That is what I was trying to allude to, was saying that these banks need to revolutionize from within. This ecosystem approach, that they also need to completely revolutionize the way they interact with the rest of the nation, of the civil society, local authority, and private sector, but not just that. We've been also discussing quite a lot the need for transparency and accountability on alignment and misalignment, which is still challenging in terms of the capacity to do that, because it needs both an understanding of the fact that alignment needs to be measured locally, but we also need to be able to monitor globally what a bank is doing in their portfolio. So that's a challenge that I think is still about, for us researchers and experts, to discuss with the practitioners and the banks. And the last thing I wanted to say is, of course, the idea that we need that countries develop policies, that they develop their own pathway to sustainability, their own INFF, which is the wording by UNDP about the national financing framework to reach sustainable development. But that's a lot about capacity building. Manish said we need to support countries doing that. And so a lot of the cooperation between PDBs might be about that, how to make money available also for that. And I think that's not, Mariana said, it's not just about reestablishing the state. The state needs to change. But then how can we help the state be that direction for sustainable development in different territories? So that was those were my takeaway messages. A big thank again to the panelists. It was a pleasure to facilitate you. I had nothing to do because you were wonderful.
Yes, I agree. Well done to all of you. Brilliant content, brilliant discussion, and brilliant moderations. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thanks, Asha.
We'll now listen to Mr. Masood Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development. Mr. Ahmed will depict the role of developing banks in the construction of more resilient societies. He will share his vision of an inclusive, sustainable, equitable and innovative recovery while we're still facing the crisis of, the COVID-19. Take a look.
Greetings. I want to make 3 points for you. First, in this immediate response to the COVID crisis, our development finance institutions have all been tested. But in the recovery to come, it is the system of development finance that is going to be tested. In this year, each institution has done the best it can. It's done a little more. It's been faster. It's trying to find new ways. Multilaterals, nationals have all tried. But given the scale of the challenge that faces us in the recovery, given the scale of financing needed, 350 billion for Africa alone over the next 3 years, given the kind of recovery that we want, it's going to be inclusive, it's going to be sustainable, it's going to be a recovery that will reach the places and the communities that have been left behind. There is no way that we can rise up to that challenge unless the community of development finance institutions, the system of development finance institution also changes the way it works. And that will be the pressure that the system as a whole will need to respond to. My second point is that when we talk about the system of development finance, we need to always remember that it is composed of many constituent parts. The big multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the regional development banks, the IMF that we talk about, but also regional, sub-regional, national, subnational development banks. And in this, the public development banks have been a huge part of the overall development finance architecture. With assets of over $11 trillion, 450 of these institutions are very large, very impactful, but like the silent majority, sometimes we've taken them for granted. And sometimes they have not been as forthcoming in terms of trying to shape and influence the overall system as they should, given their size. They are the link between international financial markets, the big multilaterals, and the businesses, the small enterprises, the large businesses in each of the countries, developing, developed, that's going to be the heart of the recovery. Particularly if you look at small and medium enterprises. They have been the most impacted in terms of sales, in terms of profits, in terms of the numbers of people they've laid off, and quite frankly, in terms of the prospects that they have for coming back after this crisis, because they don't have the depth of pockets to be able to withstand the crisis so easily. And it is the public development banks that will have to work with them to ensure that they too are part of the recovery. And my final point is that when we talk about the different recovery that's more inclusive, that's more impactful, we talk about a different way of the system of development finance working. This is about balance sheets, it's about financial models, it's about operating tools, but it's also about mindset. The mentality within the institutions has to change to recognize that they can only be effective and responsive when they work together and when they recognize the complementarities across each other, but also the mentality of the shareholders of these institutions, which are national governments, has to go from being there for them, tolerating them, periodically financing them, to being enthusiastic supporters, but also holding these institutions accountable. Because if we want these institutions to act on the many recommendations that would make the development finance system work better, including the recommendations that came from the G20-sponsored Eminent Persons Group, and if you want them to be fully aligned with the Paris Agenda and with the SDGs, then the shareholders have to empower them, but they also have to be actively engaged in holding them accountable. With these changes, the development finance institutions as a group and the development banks can help to ensure that in this recovery, all kinds of businesses and all communities will be able to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masood, Ahmed, for the clarity of your observations. Actually, your insight will be highly invaluable to nurture the following panel discussion, which will focus on business models of the public development banks in a rather complex and uncertain world. And for that, we have a brilliant panel again today. So please welcome Ms. Sherry Spiegel, who will lead the panel discussion. So Ms. Spiegel is Chief of Policy Analysis and Development at the Financing for Sustainable Development Office from the UN Department of Economics and Social Affairs. Hi, Sherry.
Hi.
It's good to have you here.
Good to see you.
It's great. So as you can see, all the panelists are there, and to share the insights on the topic, we have today 5 prominent actors in the field of development. Stephanie Griffith-Jones, Financial Markets Director at Columbia University. Hello there. We have Bruno Cabrilec, Deputy Director General of Economics and International Relations for Banque de France. We also have Sergio Guzmão-Szydlowski. I'm sorry if I got the name wrong. Sorry about that. Chief Executive Officer of the Development Bank of Minas Gerais, BDMG in Brazil. Nancy Lee, the Senior Policy Fellow at CGDF USA, who will address her message in a recorded video later on, and Serge Ekwe, the President of the West African Development Bank, the BOAD. So Sherry, over to you.
Hi there. Great, thank you so much, and it's really an honor to be with you. As has been discussed in today's meeting already, development banks play an important developmental role, in particularly including in achieving the SDGs. They are important for the provision of public goods, as well as playing a counter-cyclical role. But unlike commercial banks, public development banks have really two different aims. One is the mandate of developmental impact, and the second is that most development banks also need to have financial sustainability. This means that they have to have a different business model. Instead of just maximizing risk-adjusted returns, they need to look at both risk-adjusted developmental impact and risk-adjusted financial return together. As Professor Stiglitz said this morning, there have been many innovations in finance that development banks can use to achieve their goals, but many of these also can create new risks. And so this panel is really meant to look at what are the different business models for development banks, how are they different, what is the business model for development banks, how is it different from commercial banks, and what types of instruments can development banks use and under what circumstances. And this is not just in regular times like in normal times, but also in crises such as COVID. As was discussed in the last panel, actions that are taken today are going to. And so how can development banks address short-term needs as well as contribute to sustainable development in their actions? And what lessons can we learn from the crisis for business models going forward? As we just heard from Asha, we have a really excellent panel today that includes both academics, practitioners, and as well as practitioners from development banks who work on the ground. And so as a background for this paper, as part of for this panel, as part of the research project that was mentioned this morning, I worked on a paper together with Stephanie Griffith-Jones, Xiaojun Chu, Marco Carreras, and Natalia Nakvi on matching risks with instruments in development banks. And I'm going to pass, the first speaker will be Stephanie Griffith-Jones from Columbia University. And Stephanie, hi, good morning, or good afternoon. And the questions for you to think about in this context would be, the COVID crisis has highlighted the importance of risk management, and this includes both financial risk management, but also the risks for development impact. How can development banks best manage both financial risks and risks to development impact, and what types of instruments are most appropriate for addressing both types of risks?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. As Shari said so clearly, development banks have two aims. One is to maximize development impact, and therefore a risk which development banks face is that they do not maximize the sustainable and inclusive development impact. And that is perhaps the main risk they face. And a second aim is to be financially viable. So though it is a secondary aim, these banks should be profit making, but perhaps not profit maximizing. And in that sense, they are different from commercial banks, which have only a short-term profit maximizing role. In our research, we saw that certain types of risks are positive for development banks to take. For example, as regards the real economy. And Mariana Mazzucato mentioned the missions, the big innovations, the big sectoral changes that development banks need to support. And this means, for example, financing innovation or financing the introduction of innovative technology, often with very important positive externalities, particularly for development. And a good example of that was the initial introduction of solar or wind power, where development banks, particularly in Germany and China, really led the way. Other risks that we want development banks to take is, for example, lending to poorer regions, to poorer people, to poorer countries, or to the initial phases of infrastructure projects, the construction phase, which has much more technical and geological risk. And so this kind of economic risks, which are desirable, is different from financial engineering risks, which is originating mainly from the form of financial instruments used. I mean, financial engineering can have positive effects, particularly attracting and leveraging additional private financial flows, which is of course desirable. However, the use of these instruments can also risk redistributing risks excessively from private actors to the development banks, and ultimately the risk of contingent losses would have to be borne by governments and their taxpayers. So ideally, we think development banks should try to maximize development impact while minimizing financial engineering risk. And I think one of the conclusions of our paper and of the program is that an alternative or complementary way to ensuring a greater level of activity by development banks is to increase their capital, their paid-in capital, as was done at a major scale in the wake of the 2007-2009 development crisis, financial crisis, sorry. And it would again be very useful in a period like COVID-19, because there is so much general uncertainty and the private sector on its own tends to be very unwilling to lend. And therefore, an increase in capital would allow increased level of transactions, as well as allowing development banks to continue taking the risks that are key for development without increasing excessively contingent liabilities or lowering their credit rating. And therefore, I think it is urgent and actually to have a significant increase of capital of the MDBs, the RDBs, and the national development banks. As I said, both to increase COVID financing, so necessary at the moment, but also to maintain the orientation for the major structural transformation to a green economy and an inclusive economy. And finally, on this aspect, we feel that those countries that do not have development banks, it's very important for them to create one. And as regards to your second question, Shari, what are the types of instruments that are most appropriate for different kinds of risk? The sort of bread and butter instruments are loans, which are the ones that are mostly used and very valuable. They're normally very long term, as Joe Stiglitz mentioned. But it's interesting that development banks have been flexible, and in the COVID crisis, where a lot of companies have a lack of working capital and have difficulty paying their workers and their suppliers, development banks have shifted with great flexibility to also lending short term. And these loans can be both direct or first tier, which is probably better for major projects or key strategic projects, or they can be second tier or indirect, which is probably better for smaller projects and those in distant regions where information asymmetries are bigger and where you can have either a commercial bank or a subnational development bank like the one that Sergio heads. A second type of instruments are guarantees, which according to the literature are particularly valuable for moments of great uncertainty, again, like COVID, or also when financial markets are undeveloped. But we need to consider that they have a potential cost to taxpayers, especially if they're not well priced. And as Greenwald and Stiglitz have pointed out, if there is not an informational advantage to development banks over private banks, there is not, from a welfare point of view, an advantage to use guarantees, and perhaps it's better to do more direct lending. But they are, as I said, very important for times of great uncertainty. And finally, there is an instrument that I think is very important and which perhaps development banks should use more, which is equity, both direct and through diversified portfolios, because that has one of the many advantages it has is that it can capture the upside of potential profits, sharing not just the risk, but also the profits with the private sector. And I think it's particularly suited again for innovative technology to high-risk projects with potentially high development impact and high profit potential. So I think what we also concluded in our research in this and other papers was that there is need for further research. I'm afraid academics tend to do that, but one of the particular areas of further research is equity itself, but also how these instruments are relevant or should be adapted for countries with different levels of income. High income, middle income, or low income have different needs for different and therefore need instruments that are different, and also how they should be adapted to different sectors, to innovation, to agriculture, to industry, to infrastructure. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm going to go back to your point on how many of the development banks have used this moment to increase lending working capital loans and short-term loans, to really as a segue to our next speaker. So Mr. Cabriac from the Banque de France, if you could talk a little bit about counter-cyclical instruments that could help development banks maintain a counter-cyclical role, both in normal times and during times of crisis, such as the current one. And does the current crisis present an opportunity to really increase the use of such instruments going forward? So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Shari. Let me do a short flashback on the notion of dual mandate, which you mentioned, which has been mentioned a lot during the beginning of this conference. Well, as the public banks, particularly the national development banks, did not prove to be the best performer in terms of credit allocation, at least in terms of maximizing short-term profits. It's really important to assess how much they fulfill the second leg of their mandate, and to finance a sustainable and inclusive development and address the market failure. So let me just signal a paper from Laurent Wagner, published in the framework of the International Research Initiative on the theme of this conference, which in fact produced, and it's the first time on such a scale, maybe the proof that the national development banks did fulfill this second leg of the mandate. This research paper, using firm level data from 127 countries over the 2006-2018 period, shows that first, the NDB tends to provide more financing in more vulnerable and less developed areas. And second, the NDB play really a counter-cyclical role. So they already do that. So what can they do to strengthen this counter-cyclical role? And as Stephanie mentioned, manage the risk associated to this role. Well, first of all, they can use different tools, both on the liability and on the asset side of their balance sheet. On the liability side, for example, they can finance themselves through contingent debt instruments. For example, GDP, pure vanilla GDP-linked bonds can give them automatic rooms of maneuver to extend lending during downturn. That's quite important, and I'll come back to that answering Shari's second question. On the asset side, counter-cyclical lending is ensuring the debtor against the main exogenous macroeconomic risk he is facing. So the AFD is practicing this type of lending, and the more institutions are practicing this type of lending, the more efficient it is. And finally, both on the asset and on the liability sides, off-balance sheet instruments can be used. In fact, it has been mentioned, the guarantee has been mentioned on the asset side. Guarantee can preserve the lending capacity during downturn, as risk materialization is generally lagged. On the liability side, benefiting from MDBs or sovereign guarantees allows a transfer of the counter-cyclical power of the MDBs or of the sovereign to the National Development Bank. In the same spirit, you can, of course, recommend the use of option-based instruments. And then, of course, one very important tool to be used by the National Development Bank is tools to hedge the currency risk if they have, because the currency risk is very pro-cyclical. Let me finish by answering in just a sentence to your second question, Shari. Is it the right time to use this instrument? Yes, of course, because there is a big upside risk. So it can be appealing, at least for the investors, for example, to buy GDP-linked bonds issued by national development banks in many, many countries.
Great, thank you so much. And it's quite interesting also to think that if public development banks are able to fund themselves through state contingent bonds, that they might also consider on the asset side lending and including some of these contingencies in their own lending, possibly going forward. That could be, they could be a market leader, as well as especially if they're able to fund themselves so that they're hedged on both sides. But really, thank you so much for those really interesting comments on this. Next, I'm going to go to Nancy Lee from the Center CGD. And at CGD, you've developed concrete proposals to leverage DFI investments to invest in the SDGs. And could you describe your proposals and how such proposals could help public development banks increase their developmental impact? So Nancy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sherry. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. Let me try to briefly describe two ideas, the first of which targets critical gaps in capital markets that are hard to fill by development banks or commercial banks. And the second addresses the challenge of achieving greater systemic or market impact. On the first, we know that development banks collectively mobilize a limited volume of private finance in normal times, about 48 billion in 2018, according to OECD DAC data. And we know that the reasons are understandable and familiar: scarce bankable projects, limited risk tolerance, preference for larger transactions, reliance on senior lending, as has been just discussed, rather than more catalytic instruments. These are not failures of the model. These are really entirely consistent with the financial models of development banks. And that was before COVID. Now we face, I think, a dramatically altered reality. We know that small and medium enterprises in particular, many of which will fail, and we know that they employ some of the most vulnerable people, and in poor countries, there just is not enough fiscal space to support SMEs, and in fact, most of their governments are not doing so. So the focus coming out of the crisis has to be, importantly, on supporting SMEs with growth potential, including new and young firms. Conventional development banks don't have enough grant finance to sustain firms whose revenues have collapsed, and they're not well suited to the challenge of financing young firms or banks or financial providers. So I would argue we need to give development banks an additional set of capabilities to complement what they already have. And I'm not just talking about more concessional finance for blending. I'm talking about a wider range of tools and skills. And let me highlight 5 capabilities that seem essential to me. The first is the ability to finance early stage firms with limited track records, especially those with innovative business models that will work in the COVID and post-COVID era. The second is the use of subordinated products that fill the capital market gaps. Just as Stephanie mentioned, equity and guarantees. The third is patient investment with long maturation periods and uncertain exits. And fourth, finance in local currency. Fifth, prioritizing mobilization of other people's finance as opposed to volumes of their own transactions. So I would suggest that development bank shareholders should come together to create a purpose-built partner with these kinds of capabilities, and they can build it in such a way that incentivizes cross-development bank collaboration for scale. That's the basic idea behind our proposal for the Stretch Fund, and the idea is that it would stretch both development bank capital as well as the range of investable projects, and it would be off balance sheet, as Bruno was just mentioning. It would bring together risk-tolerant capital, experienced early-stage investors, and purpose-built instruments, and it would target below-market returns or even just preservation of equity. It would offer a suite of financial products that serve young firms as well as more mature firms. So I would suggest that creating such a fund in partnership with the development banks will ensure that any capital increases for the development banks themselves would be more catalytic. And let me just briefly describe the second proposal, which focuses really not just on sharing risk, but on reducing it. MDBs have experience and expertise in helping countries to improve their policies and institutions that directly impact the viability of investments in given sectors. Typically, MDBs condition lending to governments on sectoral reforms, but these loans are developed separately from their project finance for the private sector. They've been trying to do a better job of bringing these tools together, but they have not been able to do so consistently at scale. So I think it's time to create formal processes and agreements that drive collaboration. I'm talking about sectoral compacts, which is a little different than country compacts. They would be formal agreements between governments, the MDBs, both their public and private arms, and local development banks to promote private investment in a particular sector. Governments, in consultation with their private sectors, would commit to specific reforms that make private investment in those sectors viable. MDBs would commit loans and grants to governments to support the reforms. The private finance arms of MDBs and local development banks together would invest directly in those projects. And MDBs could offer concessional finance, such as paying for outcomes, to incentivize private innovations that deliver a defined development impact, like, for example, household access to electricity or water. Private firms would compete for access to those subsidies, and those subsidies could be awarded in such a way that would maximize the development impact per dollar of subsidy. So this three-pronged approach, support for relevant reforms, private project finance, and competitive access to concessional finance, I think would be more successful in achieving systemic impact than just the transaction-by-transaction approach that development banks tend to use. And I would argue that this approach in this period of exceptionally high risk and uncertainty is not just desirable, I think it's become essential.
Right, thank you, Nancy. Those are really interesting proposals, and really the importance of not just sharing risk and looking for risk-sharing mechanisms, but reducing risks as part of the structure is really critical, and then thinking about how do we use development banks and think more broadly in terms of a systemic approach, and how do we use a system to do this these are really critical issues. I'm really interested to see what our next two speakers think of these, and maybe at the very end, after we go through the initial round, we can get some feedback from them on their thoughts on these proposals. I'm going to go now to Sergio Suchodolski, apologies for that, from the Development Bank of Minas Gerais, to talk a little bit about draw on your experience on the business model of a subnational development bank in reaching the poorest and financing the last mile, and also how you've responded to the COVID crisis, lessons you can take from the crisis, and have you been able to link your crisis response to this longer term idea of investing in the SDGs? Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you, the French Development Agency team and my fellow panelists, and a special salute to Professor Griffith-Jones, who has been inspiring the development community for so long. BDMG is the largest state-level development bank in Brazil. We are active in 7 different states here in Brazil, and the bank is celebrating 58 years of existence with a concrete experience on the ground and serving more than 27,000 clients. We are present in 90% of the 853 municipalities of our good state of Minas Gerais. So our capillarity and track record has shown a few lessons on how we get things done on the ground. First lesson is that it's imperative to understand and be able to connect our work with the Global Development Agenda. And there I reference the Addis Ababa Finance for Development Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and of course, Agenda 2030. In this sense, BDMG has recently reshaped its strategy and business model, and the core of the transformation is to fully align with the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda, which has allowed us to better measure, communicate our results, and access funding in more adequate conditions. Another key aspect of this transformation has been the combination of a deeper specialization in the territory we finance, and with also enhanced use of digital tools. We actually service 98% of our SMEs through our digital platform. These two elements allow us to improve performance and reach a larger pool of clients on the ground through a more effective identification of investment opportunities and a better connection between local actors and global funds. Powered by partnerships with institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank, the French Development Agency, the European Investment Bank, Fondplat, and CAF, new strategy has expanded our operations and related especially to the sectors of clean energy, public health, innovation, and infrastructure, in addition to expanding specific programs and lines for valuing female entrepreneurship and working capital for SMEs. The second important lesson I want to share with you is the need for development banks to expand their activities beyond credit, and especially to become a real comprehensive development platforms. In the sense, we have been active players in project preparation of key infrastructure investments at the municipal and state levels, and we are working in a project preparation facility that will enhance the quality and scalability of sustainable infrastructure investments through effective public-private partnerships. So supporting the state and its municipalities in designing good projects and attracting private capital to expand local infrastructure, we believe is pivotal to generate local impact. Now, regarding the question around the response to the COVID crisis, in terms of our response to the COVID crisis, I would like to use three numbers that summarize our programs this year. First, the total disbursements of BDMG in 2020, they are 169% higher than 2019, and we just have surpassed the number of 2.5 billion reais disbursed so far. The total credit for SMEs has quadrupled, and they account for around 30% of our portfolio so far this year. And 50% of these disbursements are fully aligned with the SDGs. This performance is a result of a counter-cyclical strategy based in three pillars: well-being and protection of our employees, new financial products and protective measures to the bank's financial sustainability, and it's anchored in the overall strategy that I described before. Since pandemic day one, we have adopted safety and security protocols based on the best available scientific evidence, and we have put more than 95% of our employees at home in less than a week. Also, we managed to rapidly respond to the great increase in the credit demand by launching new emergency credit lines, especially to support the affected sectors and improve the state capacity to deal with the pandemic effects in the health sector. The key point here is that most of these operations, especially with SMEs, were only possible because the bank was prepared both in terms of our digital credit platform and in terms of funding, with an important contribution coming from the partnerships with international development institutions. The third aspect of the response, directly related to our new business models, is the bank's financial sustainability. as some of my colleagues have referenced, we are operating with a mix of 5 different guarantee funds, which allowed us to better allocate the risk of this new portfolio that was constructed during the context of the crisis. And additionally, we have improved our risk models and enhanced the monitoring of liquidity and market factors. In terms of the alignment of the bank's response with SDGs agenda, the most important step of this year was the launching of our sustainable bonds framework. The framework includes categories for social environmental projects that intend to be in line specifically with 13 of the 17 SDGs and 28 of the 169 SDG targets. The framework provides clear guidance on the eligibility criteria for sustainable and social projects, and also includes exclusion of sectors with negative impacts and indications for impact reports. The launching of the framework is a key step for the issue of a sustainable bond in the very, very near future. We are on the last stages for this matter. And this will be the first operation of its kind among Brazilian development institutions. So finally, and concluding, I think that most important lessons we learned in this crisis is that subnational development banks like BDMG have a meaningful contribution in the global effort to make finance work for the transition to a more sustainable development pattern, and therefore should be empowered and better integrated to the global development community. In this sense, it is important to update the current global development finance architecture, in particular the Addis Ababa Agenda for Development, to fully acknowledge their capacity to mobilize resources and implement development programs on the ground. Finally, my last point, and it's just a comment on Professor Griffith-Jones, we were able to receive the first capital increase from our shareholder. We have asked and have received green light in over 2 decades. And this has allowed us to really be successful in this major increase of our disbursement during the pandemic. I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating to see what you're doing, and really, uplifting to hear the efforts you're making and the progress you're making. When we were discussing, so much of the discussion at the UN right now is how we're off track to meet the SDGs. And so it's really wonderful to hear the efforts being made on the ground to actually align work with the SDGs and to really make the SDGs to move them forward. And in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda negotiations, national development banks were brought in for the first time into an international agreement. And at the time, I think there was a lot of skepticism. It stayed in the agreement, but there were a lot of questions as to what their role would be, and skepticism even as to their ability to really contribute. And so I think that 5 years later, to hear what's happening on the ground is really wonderful. For the next example, we're going to go to Sergey Eku, the president of the West African Development Bank, to hear what examples from your side as to how your bank has responded to the COVID crisis. What instruments have you used, and what lessons can you take from the crisis? And will the operations more recently affect how you operate going forward? So really over to you to talk about your experiences on the ground. Thank you.
Sherry, thank you very much. I'll try to wrap it under one and a global answer. First of all, the West African Development Bank is the common development finance institution for 8 member countries of the West African Economic and Monetary Union, namely Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. We've been, on the cumulative side, we've been supporting these countries from inception for roughly 9 billion euro. Now, the question you're asking is basically related to this COVID, which is nothing else but an exogenous shock. But basically, we could face other shocks, all right? So we so the answer to your question is to which extent our balance sheets is resilient enough to either endogenous or exogenous shocks. So the COVID crisis is putting under scrutiny the adequacy of traditional instruments used by MDBs, the firepower of these institutions, as well as their ability, agility, and responsiveness. So let me try to answer to the question you have to the question you brought to my attention with two perspectives, short-term and long-term, to make it easy. So the short-term perspective is kind of easy in the sense that the response we've been bringing to the market is based on the idea that cash is king. At the end of the day, cash is king. So our response was to be quick and, I believe, effective. The financial package, which is the direct financial support for West African Economic and Monetary Union member states and project financing, was based on, first of all, concession loans to each member states, up to, it was 18 years maturity, door to door, with 5 years deferred and an exit rate of 2.75%. And another, on the other hand, with a 100 billion program in refinancing line to local banks intended to stimulate the economic activities of SMEs. On the mobilization side, a financing agreement signed with the AFD for 100 million euro. Again, the question here, the short-term response, immediate response, as you have seen, was based on the idea that cash was king. Cash being king, so the way we have answered that, we have answered to our immediate response was, first of all, how to mobilize assets, how to ensure swap lines or repo lines. Again, that's the idea of how can we have more agility in the management of the balance sheet, how to secure permanent/ultimate access to central bank liquidity. Again, this idea of cash being king. So on the mobilization side, we have an observation I have to make at this point in time, which is African country in general, West African country more specifically, have a few difficulties, are not able to get financing at affordable costs, which leads to this debate about the debt sustainability challenges. Now, what are the solutions? The solution here, again, on a long-term perspective, but it has been alluded here by a number of panelists here, is a question of the Tier 1 capital, how to raise capital, Tier 1 capital, which would lead us using the leverage ratio to tap the debt market, which is a tremendous market. The debt market, senior debt market, has been very active. And if you look at the results, and look at the commercial bank, investment bank are currently publishing their quarterly results. 2020 is going to be a hell of a year when it comes to debt capital market. Senior debt capital market is going to be a tremendous year. And the reason is there is the need for sustainable, reliable, tangible project, but the liquidity is there. The hell of liquidity is there. So the question is how to mobilize this liquidity. So first of all, so the question of raising Tier 1 capital is one of the answers. The second one, which is, I believe, a very smart answer, is the question of the guarantee issuance, which changed the scope of doing business now, which is no longer let's knock at the door of the World Bank, but let's ask the World Bank, but could be the World Bank, the IMF, or any AAA rating institution. So let's now knock at their door, not to raise funding, but for issuance guarantee. In such a way that they could absorb first loss, or in a basket, first to defaults losses. So the question is more how to increase the importance of instruments there will be included in bond indices. As an example, Benin Republic has been working on such transactions, and we believe that these are the smart ways, innovative ways of doing business now. Question again of issuing of social development bonds to provide investment that have a social impact while enhancing transparency in the use of funds. Well, you have, as I mentioned earlier, this profound and intense, deep senior debt market. But in the same time, we also have what I call the dedicated fund market, either eligible for green, climate, etc. The market is there, the demand is there, the offer is there as well. Working with foundation or NGOs on debt swap instruments. This also could be an area to look into. We do believe that, again, innovative ways of answering the question you have asked us. Designing in the same way a tailored instrument, enhancing partnership as we have recently done in Austria, with the Development Bank of Austria. Again, dedicated fund, allocated fund to project with a very strict reporting. On the allocation side, when you look at things from a holistic standpoint, we do believe that, let me quote the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, we have a gap like $100 billion gap financing on a yearly basis. And we know that if we sum up all the balance sheets of the different banks in the continent, that will never be enough to fund this gap. So we do believe in solutions like ensuring greater additional and complementary between MDBs, moving away from a competitive landscape to foster greater cooperation. We strongly believe that securitization would allow credit organizations to benefit from liquidity without refinancing. We believe that adopting a sectorial approach by targeting either underfinanced or strategic sectors could be also a solution to the question you have raised. Thinking out of the box and creating together new innovative tools, for instance, for the informal sector, which would represent a large share of the economies in the region. Last but surely not the least, do have one more minute, Sherry.
Just one, because we want to get to questions.
Just one. Yeah, we have just launched our strategic plan for 21-25, which is called Joliba. It is a way for us to focus on five sectors: infra, energy, agriculture, real estate, for social housing / tourism, health, and education. So we do believe in this sectoral approach, and we do believe that the West African Development Bank should be more and more seen as a go-to bank in these 5 sectors, to be seen as an expert banks in the sectors I've just earlier mentioned. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, and you've really outlined quite a lot of innovative ideas and instruments that could be used going forward. And Stephanie, this is over in a sense to you and the researchers to think more about where we need to do additional research to support many of these, the new instruments, and how they could be best used, and to support development banks in those efforts. I think we have only around less than 10 minutes left, and we wanted to have time for questions and answers. So maybe we could put all of the panelists back on the screen, if that's possible. Hi, everybody. And while we're waiting for some cute answers to be shared with us from the audience, maybe I could just ask some of you to respond to some of what each others have said. For example, I would be really interested, Sergio, in hearing your thoughts, if you can, not to put you on the spot, in terms of Nancy's proposals. If you're able to sort of give some thoughts on that, and then we can get from Asha to get over to you for some questions from the audience. So
Absolutely.
maybe for just 1 minute, Sergio, and then over to Asha.
Thank you. I think Nancy's proposals are very interesting, very provocative and agenda. I do think, and many of us have referenced, and including yourself, Sherry, I mean, we've been 5 years into all of these agendas that guide our work in the different levels, right? In terms of the multilateral development banks, regional development banks, national development banks, subnational development banks, and we have a concrete example from some of our partners, including practitioners such as I am in Serge with BOAD, right? So there's kind of a cascade way, and I think we should relate to partnerships. So what we've been doing here is to first realize that we are not isolated. Despite being a subnational development bank, we are not isolated. So we need to plug in not only into the agendas, but also into the examples, the operational examples, financial instruments that we can tap into and use our good banks as innovation platforms, right? We should do some experimentalism, of course, with responsibility. We do run financial institutions. And in this sense, what we've been doing other than receiving a lot of support in technology and also in resources, not only financial, but we also been partnering with other banks in Brazil and in Latin America. And more recently, we just signed an MOU with the BSA, with my good friend Patrick Dlamini, the CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We are sharing with them our digital platform for SMEs. We had first had an engagement during the COP25 in Madrid last year. They were following our efforts and our performance during this year, especially being able to reach the end of the small guy at the end of the line during the pandemic. And now we've been having a series of workshops and close collaboration that is now covered by an MOU we just signed just a few weeks ago. So I think this is a very concrete example on how we can be effective in implementing SDG 17 and linking development institutions of different sizes and different geographies with the agenda that Nancy has referred to. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So Asha, over to you for some questions.
Yes,
for the
absolutely. Thank you. Very, very interesting insights here. And we have a couple of questions here, Sherry, and then I'll pass it over to you just to conclude and wrap up the whole roundtable here. So first question here from Susan Engel. So for the panel, innovative financial instruments were the cause of the last global crisis. How have they changed to mean they will be in the solution this time? I don't know if that question could be addressed by anyone would like to jump in there.
I'm sure Stephanie wants to answer that.
Yeah, I can see that.
I think that's an excellent question. I think the challenge is to design financial instruments that help development, in fact, but they do not undermine financial stability. And one example that Bruno gave, and that Sherry and I agree a lot, is, for example, state contingent instruments, so that they become easier to pay when the economy is doing well, and they get some relief when the economy is doing badly. So this is the kind of instrument which I would say are good for development banks and for their development impact. On the other hand, I worry about the instruments which are, for example, not well-structured securitization. They may have a role, but we don't want to go precisely down the path that led to to Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis in 2008-9. So I think when we're thinking of, for example, how to save fiscal resources, we shouldn't just think also about the short-term impact, but also about the long-term impact. Because if you do things cheaply from the government point of view, but you are creating contingent liabilities where the chickens may come to roost in 15 years, then you may be creating a bigger future problem.
Thank you. We can probably take, there's one question I think is a little bit provocative. I want the person asking the question about development banks, are they fit for equity business? Banking is about covering risks. Equity investment is about taking it. How could a public bank have that dual vision unless they specialize a team for capital risk? So I think that's an interesting question. So who would like to take it? Yes. Yes, please.
I think that's an excellent point. You can't just tell an officer that's been doing senior lending for for 20 years for his or her career to start doing equity investment successfully. And especially the kind of equity investment I was talking about, which is early stage equity investment, which is difficult in advanced countries, let alone in poor countries. So I think development banks are confronted with a choice, which is either they develop the skills and the tools inside their institutions on their balance sheets to do this effectively, which means taking a lot more risk and having more volatility in their returns, or they create something off balance sheet, which allows them to put these more subordinated products off balance sheet in combination with their more senior products. So my proposal on the stretch fund is the latter, because I think it's going to be very difficult for the shareholders of these institutions, which are after all governments for the most part, to, at least in the short term, accept institutions that are much more risky and more uncertain with respect to their returns. Because one thing we really have to remember is that a lot of the equity that is put into these development banks over time is actually the retained earnings of the institutions, which add to their capital. So shareholders face a choice of either accepting a lot more risk and lower returns, and therefore making it more difficult to expand these institutions, or creating something off balance sheet. But it is a choice that I think now confronts them inevitably at this point. I don't think they can avoid this choice during this period of very much heightened risk and very much essential counter-cyclical activity.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Another question here. How can development banks address on a timely basis and an impactful way the recovery of post-conflict settings? I mean, humanitarian, development gap, and contingent. So, right. So how can what role can development banks play there? Tricky question. Anybody jump in there? I think one. Yes, I think I can see. Yes, Sergio. Please go ahead.
I will try to use an analogy. We of course don't have the direct experience of post-conflict situation, but we do have two experiences of post-tragedy, natural tragedy situations. So we had here in Minas Gerais, and I think some of you are familiar, two ruptures of mining dams, very large ones.
Absolutely.
That have destructed several municipalities. The first one 5 years ago, and a recent one with a very large human tragedy, killing dozens of people, and really leaving the ground as if a conflict had existed. So the analogy is that you do have a region with several municipalities and displaced people, and we have partnered with the foundation created by the company that was responsible for this raptor in creating programs, several programs to first mitigate the effects, work on water and sewage treatment for, in our case, it's 35 municipalities that were affected, and also creating programs to attract larger investments, but also to finance with special conditions, actually concessional loans for SMEs, so that people who are there can sort of restart their businesses that were completely destroyed, or even go into a new business if their previous activity is no longer possible. So I do think there is a role for development banks. Actually, this is at the heart of the creation of development banks. If we look at 1944, the spirit of Bretton Woods, and bearing in mind that the first loan from the World Bank was to rebuild and reconstruct France.
That's, I think that's brilliant to answer part of the question. Sherry, I think we have less than 3 minutes. I would say 2.5 minutes for you just to wrap it up and just conclude this panel discussion, which was great, by the way. As I was telling Sebastian this earlier, that it's hard to manage a panel like this by not seeing each other. So it's very challenging. Good job to all of you. Just Sherry, over to you for the wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Asha. And thanks to all the panelists for the really interesting and very insightful comments that I think have really highlighted the important role and the potential for using innovations, but also the risks in doing so. You know, I really was listening when I was listening to Nancy's comments about the use of equity instruments and the different possibilities. As somebody who used to invest in markets and even invested through other funds, no matter how it's done, the capacities have to be in nationally and in the local banks as well. Even if it's outsourced, you need to have capacities in the house to better really understand where their money's going. So one of the really important lessons is going to be, as we build up and continue to use more and more complicated instruments, is really both understanding risks and building capacities in-house. And this is why groups like the IDFC and this conference are so critical, because by bringing together different development banks and bringing together different from different regions and different mandate and different types of development banks, also different from countries at different stages of development, is really an opportunity for people to learn from each other. Because ultimately, no matter what instruments are used, lessons from the global financial crisis, when we think about securitization, can these instruments be used in ways that are going to overcome some of those past risks? You really need to have the capacities to do that. And so it's more important than ever for everyone to be learning from each other, from each other's experiences, which is why this is such an important, really critical initiative. So thank you so much. Thank you to the panel. And I look forward to hearing from all of you in the future, learning more. And Asha, back to you to conclude.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you again for this brilliant insights. We will now address, probably watch the video of the address of Carmen Reinhart, the Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. Take a look.
So it's a pleasure to be here virtually. And in my brief remarks, I would like to address the very important issue of global capital flows. Amidst the COVID crisis, of course, a major source of concern is that capital flows to developing countries and emerging markets dry up very quickly. And in effect, we got an incredible preview of that in April, early May, when capital flows to the developing world collapsed. Since then, there's been stabilization. Private capital flows tend to be very pro-cyclical. My own work with Kaminsky and with Vey has shown that. Very recent work that I'm drawing on here with Vincent Reinhart and Christoph Trebisch have highlighted that private capital flows tend to surge when we have booming commodity prices, when growth in the recipient countries is strong, and therefore they tend to reinforce the boom, and unfortunately they also tend to reinforce the bust. Beyond the conventional financial cycle, beyond commodity prices, when we look at the historic patterns in capital flows, private capital flows, respond negatively to a much higher incidence of debt problems, of default. So what we are looking at is the reinforcement of a commodity cycle, a downturn in commodity prices, a downturn in growth, and the prospect of a higher incidence of sovereign defaults. All those factors tend to suggest a retrenchment, a major retrenchment in private capital flows. Now, by contrast, what the work that I have done with Sebastian Horn and Christoph Trebisch, what this work shows, looking at a 200-year history in official flows, is that official flows, meaning either bilateral official flows or multilateral official flows, this is now in the context of post-World War II, are countercyclical. In other words, they are stabilizing. When private capital steps out, official capital steps in. And this is pretty much switching now gears to where we are and where we may be heading. This is pretty much what we've seen so far in 2020. If you look by any metric, even as I mentioned earlier, we had a significant reversal, a sudden stop in capital flows in the spring. They've stabilized somewhat, but have weakened again in August and into the fall and winter. And the big question, of course, is what the prospects are. I will deal with that lastly. But in that interim, as capital flows were stepping out, what we've seen is a major surge in official lending by the multilaterals. This is very much in line with historical prospects. So what does that mean going forward? I think the gist of it is that when we look ahead into the post-COVID, taking into account the factors, the drivers of capital flow that I alluded to, growth in the recipient countries, commodity prices, global commodity prices, and the prospect of a higher incidence of default, as already evidenced in the fact that this year we have seen a record number of sovereign downgrades by the major credit rating agencies. What this means is we're looking at a period ahead of very shaky private capital flows. And I think, there's a certain sense of optimism that the recovery post-COVID will be fueled by a renewed return of private capital. Let me, in this brief message, leave a big question mark of how soon we can expect this. If you look at most of the global growth projections, including global prospects put out by the World Bank or the OECD or the IMF World Economic Outlook, prospects for recovery are there, but it is a protracted recovery. It's not an immediate recovery. The good news is that in periods like this, if the past is any guide, we are looking at continued resource flows from the multilaterals to tide in some magnitude or offset in some magnitude the drying up of private flows. But back to the bad news is that the size of private flows is on a scale that is very difficult for official flows to match. Bottom line is, I think, looking ahead, even assuming aside a major delay in recovery, I think we will see a period of very skittish private markets with emerging markets that continue to have access to finance being quite vulnerable to sudden stops. And in that note, let me leave you with a message: caution in managing flows is the buzzword.
Thank you, Carmen, Reinhart, for this address and for reminding us of the crucial role of the development banks in the vulnerable and uncertain times that we, and more specifically, emerging markets are going through. Before we conclude this session, this conference today, you know, lots have been said during the past 2 hours, and there were lots of messages. So we have selected the key takeaways that you should remember today. So we'll sum it up to 3 of them. So PDBs need to put in place a comprehensive approach fully aligned with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. The PDBs should have the capacity to act at scale. And finally, private development banks should increase their accountability and transparency framework. That's it for today. So tomorrow we will continue the discussion on the importance of public development banks as key players to invent financing solutions while maintaining a sustainable economic model and recovery. Well, just to remind you, but you already know it, the Sustainable Development Goals were defined by the United Nations to provide a vision to revolutionize thinking and change the ways global systems work. I hope that today we have demonstrated the impact of the public development banks on the transition to a more prosperous world. Our day together now comes to an end. I would like to thank all of our eminent speakers and invite you to continue this journey together. Please connect with us tomorrow, same time, same platform, to hear brilliant contributions from more speakers about the potential of public development banks. In the meantime, I encourage you to navigate on the Visible Hand platform to download the research reports and exchange your views and ideas to advance the conversation through our networking tools. Well, until tomorrow, keep safe and goodbye.